Hello everyone, in this video we are building an 8 by 12 shed. I'm gonna be walking through step by step from making the gravel pad all the way to installing the last hinge on the door. This is a very fun and pretty straightforward project. And to help you, I created a shopping cart with all the materials I used to build this shed, and you can find in the description below. And to make it even easier, we have a complete set of plans also in the description that you can download and follow along with the video. So let's get started by locating the shed.
First, you need to pick the spot for your shed. It's mostly up to you, but there are a few things to think about. You want it to be easy to get to for when you're building and for when you're using it. Also, it's best to put the shed on flat ground. That makes it much easier to build the pad and the shed itself. But if you have a yard sloped like mine, it's a bit tricky. And you see just how much work that adds up to the project. So we begin digging. It's pretty simple. Start on one side and dig like you're making stairs, stepping up every 5 to 6 inches. Next, we dig the bottom side, which is the easiest because there's less material to remove. And then we go onto the right side slope, same way as before, and finishing it up, digging across the top. And after you've done your first pass at digging for your 4x6 boards, we'll set up better boards and then start framing. But I just want to walk you through the way I do things, and you may do a little different, but this is how I suggest. You start at the lower spots and you make your way up. Good trick I learned is that these boards are 5.5 inches deep, so you kind of measure 5.5 inches on your pick, and then you start digging upward, right? And as that 5.5 inches clears the finish grade, you kind of know that you need to step up to another level of digging. Now we're going to put up some better boards around, and that's going to help us guide where to place the lumber. And here's a little trick. If you go to the big box stores, you're going to find sprayed lumber like this on the kind of clear section. Usually these means that these are 70 to 90% off, and they're not the best lumber, but for better boards or scrap boards, this will do the job. To set up your better boards and string, I use 3 stakes on each corner. And then I run one board on each side and use it to tie the string to it. The better boards and string at this point is just to make sure that my pad is square. So I won't worry too much about leveling the string, and I'll use a 4-foot level instead. So now that we have our strings up and our better boards, we kind of know how much we need to remove to finalize our grading here. I like to do this afterwards, as I said, because I don't want the string on the way as I'm heavy digging. The final digging is pretty easy. It's just right, little here, little there, trying to get it to line up with the strings. Then after cleaning up, we'll place about 1 inch to 2 inches of gravel underneath. That's to help drainage, and we'll lay the 4x6 right on top of it. I'm going to start with a 14-foot section. For this part, I have an 8-foot board that we attach to a 6-foot section later. When joining these boards, I make a notch on both ends and screw them together. This notch is 5 inches deep by half of the thickness of the board. One important thing to remember is that whenever you cut pressure-treated lumber, you need to treat it again. The pressure-treated lumber you buy at the store is only treated on the outside. To treat the lumber again, you need to apply some type of wood preservative. We'll bring in the second section and make sure it's level. Most likely, we're gonna need to adjust this to make it level. Once it's level, we'll add one leg screw to hold the two pieces together. Let's make sure that this stays in place. So we go back to the beginning and drill a 5/8 hole and drive a rebar into it, holding it to the ground. We then drill a second hole right in the middle where the two boards meet. Same thing, driving a rebar through it. Last one, it's towards the end. These 3 rebars should hold the board in place. So once you have your first 4x6 row ready, secured, and leveled, it's time to go and start moving upward. The way I do these, I go one at a time, one section at a time. So here I measure this distance and I pre-cut the first 4x6 that's gonna go, and then we'll build up the second level, the third level, and so on and so forth. Eventually you look something like this. This is just dry fit. I haven't secured it down just yet, so we're gonna secure that together. And then on the top level above, I'm having one full section and some blocks underneath securing. And then down here you're gonna see 3 full lengths of 4x6 holding up the pad together. Also, I'm using these pink rebars to secure them together. These are very handy, super light to work. You can cut them with the sawzall pretty easy. I'm having one on the smaller section, followed by a couple on each end, and the same thing up here.
Now let's put it out together. We'll begin with the smaller section and then moving on to the large piece. To join these 4x6 boards, I use 6-inch long lag screws on the ends. And as we build up, we'll keep checking for level. And notice how I stagger the ends for stability. To make sure that these first few rows don't move, we anchor them down with rebars. I put one right in the corner and then another one about 4 feet away. I work on the top level next using a full 8-foot section, and then on the side I cut a small piece of 4x6 at a 45-degree angle. This way there are no sharp edges or trip over, and also it adds a bit of charm. Now we do the same thing we did on the left side. Clear away any dirt and make sure we're still level. Starting with the short piece on the bottom, screwing that together. Moving on to the second row. And before we put on the third row, we finish up the last row on the front. Now we're able to finish up the third row, putting up a full 10-foot piece on the side. And lastly, we go all the way to the back, finish it off that section, and completing the framing.
And now we have our framing complete. It came out pretty good. The only thing left here is to drive down these rebars. Originally, as you guys saw, I drove 3 rebars to hold the framing in place, and then I framed around. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna finish up with 1 in the back, 2 along each side over there, and then the 3 just like we had it here originally.
I ended up with 3 rebars that hit rock and wouldn't go all the way down. So I had to cut them off. And as long as the rebars go through all the boards, they should be holding the frame pretty well. Now let's talk about backfilling. I knew I would be bringing some material to even out the slope ground. It took me about 10 wheelbarrows of dirt from a pile I had nearby. When you're doing this, just think about whether it might be better to dig deeper into the ground so you don't have to bring as much dirt in, or have to remove some dirt. Once you're done backfilling, try to compact the ground as best as you can. It's a good idea to rent a compactor. But if you can't, using a hand compactor might work for you.
And we are almost there. Moving dirt, it's heavy work, and that's why we do these videos, to show you so you can make the decision whether you want to do this project or hire somebody. If you do want to do this project and you want additional help, check the description below. We're going to share with you the plans to build this 8x12 shed from the ground up, including the material list, and they'll help you save time and money when it's your turn to build a shed.
I finished spreading and leveling the dirt, and then I put down a weed barrier.
This is really important. Even though it costs some money up front, you save a lot of trouble in the long run because you won't have to worry about weeds growing through the gravel. It's time to get some gravel. You can use different kinds, but for this project, I suggest getting number 57 gravel. It's cheap and good for drainage. I recommend at least 3 inches of gravel. And for a project this big, it's about 2 tons. Just remember, the more gravel you have, the better it will be for drainage. This took 2 trips on my pickup to bring all the gravel in. If you want, you can ask to have it delivered. I suggest getting it delivered only after you're done framing the box. You don't want to be moving the gravel around. The last few things here is just level off the gravel and compact it down as much as possible. Building a gravel foundation pad like this one is a lot of heavy work, but it's important to have a solid foundation before you start building the shed floors.
We're gonna be building our shed flooring on top of 4x4 skids. But before we start, we wanna make sure that these 4x4s are leveled and pretty squared.
Also, we build the shed on top of skids so we can move it if we have to. On these 4x4 skids, I always like to cut an angle off the end of each in case I need to slide them back and forth. And remember, anytime you cut pressure treated lumber, you need to treat it again. After cutting all 4 ends, make sure the skid is level and squared. And if you remember, when we built our pad, it was a foot longer than the shed itself. So we used that foot measurement to start our starting points for the skid. Then you do the same on the other side, and just keep in mind that you may have to remove some material to make sure the skids are leveled. We grab the two 12-foot ledger boards and place them on top of the skids.
Alright, so our shed is going to be 8x12. And these 12 foot ledger boards, they are actually 12 foot 1 1/8. So we need to make sure we cut this back to 12 feet.
And after you cut all the ledger boards, you want to add a toenail to the end of each ledger. This toenail is just to secure the ledger to the skid while you keep assembling the floor. We measure 2 joists to 92 inches and we cut them. We place one on the front of the framing and one on the back. When securing down these joists, I like to add 3 nails to each of them. The 3 nails should be sufficient to keep this box secure while we keep installing the center joists. We have 8 remaining joists that needs to be cut, and we do the same on all of them. Remember, 92 inches in length. And as always, make sure to retreat the end of each joist. It's nice if you keep this nearby, so every time you make a cut, you can quickly grab it. We place the joist in the center, 16 inches apart from each other. And the reason for the 16 inches is that every floor sheeting will start on a joist and end on a joist. From here on, I use 2 3-inch nails per joist. If you don't have a nail gun, you can use 3-inch screws instead. Just remember, you can always check the description below the video. We will continue to share the whole material list with you, also with the plans for this project to help you out when it's your time to build your shed. And before we start sheeting this floor, I just want to mention that I do add couple toenails for every other bay. That's to make sure that these joists don't move against the skids. And then we check the square of this frame. You can check by doing the 3-4-5 rule, Or you can check by measuring the opposite corners. Whichever corner is longer, you just need to tap it in. You measure one corner and you move to the other corner. You want the same measurement on both.
And now that we've done framing our flooring, it's time to put the sheeting. And before we put the sheeting, I always use some adhesive along the joists, and we'll screw down the sheeting with 2-inch construction screws.
For this floor, I use 2 tubes of construction adhesive. They do make adhesive specifically for subflooring if you decide to go that route. When laying down the OSB, try not to move too much, or you may end up removing the adhesive you just added. I use number 8 2-inch grip right construction screws on the floor, placing them about 12 inches apart from each other, which means 4 screws per row. For the second OSB, I stagger the pattern of the first one and screw it down just like we talked about. These boards come marked which side should be facing up. Make sure to follow that. And lastly, the third OSB, we need to cut it, and it should be pretty close to half. I screw it down first, then I snap a string so I see where I need to cut, and the remainder half I use it on the back side. You lay that down carefully and screw it down like we talked, and you are done. And with the floor framed, it's time to start building walls. And before we start anything, I like to lay out the top and bottom plates around the whole shed. And then mark any of the main features you may have, like doors and windows.
So this wall is going to be 88 inches long.
And once you have the top and bottom plate done for the front wall, it's time to move to the second wall. For the next wall, which is 12 feet long, you can either measure the 2x4 and make your marks, or using a square, line it up with the end of the shed floor and mark it. You then just cut the top and bottom plate and move on to the next wall. The next wall is just like the first one we cut. It's 88 inches long. Again, we cut the top and bottom plate and then lay them in place. For the final wall, we do the same as before. We cut it at 12 feet long, both of the 2x4s.
Now if you notice, I use a square to cut these straights and a skill saw. This shed can be built pretty much with a set of skill saw, sawzall, you need an impact gun, a drill. You don't necessarily need a nail gun, but I recommend. If you have one, it goes much easier and faster. But just a set of basic power tools will get you going on this job.
Now that we have cut all the top and bottom plates, you can set them aside and bring in the 92-inch long 2x4s you bought from the store. Most of the building is gonna happen right here on the shed floor. This floor makes it a very good platform as you start building up these walls.
And now we're ready to start framing the first wall, which is the wall opposite from me. That wall is the easiest of all. There's no windows, no doors.
For a basic wall, it's easy because all the studs will be 16 inches apart. So just mark the top and bottom plate.
Now it's time to nail these boards together, building our walls. If you have a framing gun, it's much faster. Obviously, it's pretty expensive to get one of these, specifically for a project like this. But if you have access to a framing gun, again, much easier and faster. If you don't have a framing gun, you can use screws, 2.5-inch screws.
I like to start with 3 nails on the 2x4s on the ends. And then I move in and I add 2 nails to each 2x4 in betweens.
Now let's go over to the other side, but this time I'm going to use screws, just so we have an experience framing these walls with screws. not too difficult putting this together with screws. However, they do come with a price. They're a little pricier than nails. So if you do have a nail gun, you save some money. If not, screws will do just the job. Alright, so now we're gonna create some jigs that's gonna help us lift that wall and hold it in place by ourselves. If you do have a friend or somebody that can help you, you may want to skip this, but this is very handy even if you have a friend.
You need to cut two blocks that are about 16 inches long. Then you screw them to the floor frame, which is gonna help keeping the wall in place after you lift it. After that, take a piece that's about 3 to 4 feet long, cut a 45-degree on the end, and screw that right in the middle of the wall. Now lift it up the whole wall and watch as the 2x4 support moves along the floor. Then you just need to adjust the wall a little bit. You may need a hammer at this point to move the wall from side to side until it's in the right spot. Before you put any nails or screws on the 2x4 support, check to see if it's level. And then to secure the wall in place, I add 2 nails to each bay. I like to center the nails on top of the ledger board as best as I can. And once you have the wall in place, you are free to remove the 2x4 blocks you just added. The second wall is another easy wall to build. Go ahead and mark your 16 inches to center on the top and bottom plate. Then you lay out and space your 92-inch long wall studs. And then you just nail them, both the bottom and the top plate. Just like before, put your supporting blocks in first. For a wall this small, it's pretty light, so you may not need the center 2x4. It's up to you. And then to support the wall in place, 2 nails on each bay. To connect the 2 walls, you line them up, and using a clamp, you hold them in place. Then just nail every 16 inches or so going up the wall to keep them joined together.
And now we have completed 2 of the 4 walls. These were pretty basic, pretty straightforward, nothing to add to it. Our third wall, however, is going to get a little more challenging. It's going to have a window, and together we're going to lay this out and build the wall.
Mark your 16 inches on center on both the bottom and top plate. Then just lay out your wall studs so we can start measuring these.
When framing for a window, you do the customary 16 on center for every stud, right? All of these. And then you locate your window. Our window is going to be 2 feet away from the end of the wall. So at 2 feet, we'll start our window. And the window itself is 2 feet wide. Right after the window ends, the first stud is the jack. So we'll measure 1.5 inches for the jack stud. And then after that, we have the king stud, which is the stud that goes all the way through. The jack stud is meant to hold the header and support the window. And you do the same on the left side. And don't worry if you didn't get all those measurements just right. We're going to have plans and material lists in the description below. So make sure you check that out. They'll help you when it's your time to build your shed.
So you can start nailing all your wall studs in place, and then we'll work on the window next. Now that we have nailed down all the wall studs, it's time to build our window header. To build the header, we need to cut 2 pieces of 2x6, each of them 27 inches long. And normally, you want to add 1/2 inch of plywood between the 2x6 to count as fillers. I didn't have any over here, but I did use it when I framed the doorway, and I'll show you how to do that later on. You add 2 nails to the end of the header on each side, and in between you add a single nail, one at the top and one at the bottom, going down the header. Time to put in the cripple studs. These are 6¼ inches long, and for this window I need 2 of them. After cutting 2 pieces, I nailed them to the top plate. I had to use the hammer to hammer them back in because they're a little loose. You put the header back between the studs and just use a couple toenails to secure it to the cripple studs. And for the jack studs, we measured them to be 81.5 inches long. So we went ahead and cut 2 of them and nailed them to the king studs, both on the left and right sides, going all the way down and hitting the bottom plate while we edit. We cut the seal plates the same length as the header, and to support the seal plates, we'll need to cut 2 cripple studs. We laid these boards out and we nailed the cripple studs to the bottom plate first, the seal plates, and then to the jack stud. Now let's lift our third wall. Remember to put the support blocks on the floor frame ends before you do this. And it's a good idea to plan ahead, move the tools out of the way just to make it easy. Then you push the wall against the stop blocks. Make sure that the wall is level before you put in a nail through the supporting stud. Then you go around the back and you add couple nails on every bay as we've been doing so far. And it's time to join the 2 walls together. Grab yourself a clamp it as high as you can, and as we did before, add a nail every 16 inches going up the wall. After going back and looking at this, I noticed that I missed a couple nails on the header. So make sure you nail the header to the king stud when you're assembling on the ground. It's time to build our last wall. In this wall, we're gonna have a door. So we start by laying out where all the studs and cripple studs are gonna go. And similar to what we did with the windows, we locate where the door is gonna go, and to the right and left we find the jack stud and the king stud. Then we lay the lumber out for the outside studs and the king stud. And also at this point you can start nailing them together to the top and bottom plate. Then it's time to measure and cut the jack studs. With the help of a clamp, you can nail them to the king studs and the bottom plate. It's time to build our headers, and we do that by cutting the 2x6s. And this time we're gonna add 1/2 inch plywood between the 2x6 as a filler. You assemble everything together and you add 2 nails to the end of the header on each side, and then across the header, one on the top and one on the bottom going down. I added 5 cripple studs above the header, which were 6¼ inches long. I nailed them through the top plate and against the header. I installed the stoppers on each side of the floor frame. It's time to lift the wall, and we've done this before, so we know we need to push it against the stops and add couple nails on each bay. Using a clamp, we hold all the walls together, and then we nail every 16 inches going up the wall. Time to add the double top plate. This is nothing more than another set of 2x4s that goes on top of the top plate. You just place them in on top and you nail every 16 inches or so. And now that you're done framing your shed, it's time to start thinking about siding. The 2 most popular options for siding a shed are either a T111 siding or the LP Smart siding. And the difference between the 2 of them is that T111 boards is wood board. So that's going to require some maintenance. You're going to have to paint it and prime it every few years. Now, LP Smart siding comes pre-primed. It's engineered wood with resin. And what that is it's termite resistant. This product, it's going to make your shed last much longer. I start by measuring 1/4 inch down from the 2x6 ledger. That is because you want to have an overlap allowing water to run off beyond the non-pressure treated OSB flooring we just installed. I snap a chalk line all around the shed so I can visually see where the bottom of the boards are gonna land. And because this is a one-man job, I added 2x4 blocks all around to help me lay the boards on it as I install them.
Before we start installing the LP Smart Siding, let's talk about the hardware we need for this. You want to use at least 1.5" siding nails. The beauty about this is that you can get them loose in a box like this and you can drive them with a hammer, or you can get a coil of nails used for your nail gun if you have one. I'm going to take both approaches here and you can decide which method to use.
Time to lay out my first panel board. When laying out the panel, you want to make sure it's oriented so the next panel can sit on top of the previous one. I add one nail on one of the sides and I use it to pivot the panel to level position. To help pivot the panel, you can use your foot if you need. Once the panel is leveled, I added a second nail on the opposite side and then I can start nailing the panels in place from there. As far as nail spacing, I nailed the panels 16 inches apart going vertical, and on the top and bottom plate, I nailed them every 8 inches. Time to bring in the second panel. You may have to readjust the supporting block. Whenever overlapping the two panels, you want to make sure that the next panel is touching the alignment bead of the previous panel. That allows for an 1/8 of an inch expansion gap. And when nailing the two panels together, you want to drive the nail between both panels at the same time. I then pivot the panel in place, check for level, add a second nail, and then I'm ready to finish nailing. One thing to note is whenever you're pivoting these panels in place, make sure not to put too much pressure on one corner, otherwise you break off.
We have the first two boards in. It's okay doing with a hammer. The thing is, I got 2.5" nails. That's the only thing I had in store. Remember, at least 1.5" nails. That makes drive it in much easier the shorter the nails. Next, we're gonna switch over to the nail gun, and the way I like to do it is do all the complete sheets, the full sheets first, then we'll come back and do all the cuts.
I now bring in the third panel to be installed in the back of the shed. I put in 2 nails, the second one pretty loose so I can remove it when checking for level. Once the panel is level, I grab the nail gun and in the same pattern as before, I nailed the panel in place. The fourth and fifth panel are very similar to the first two I did on the other side. Obviously, this went much faster with the nail gun. One thing I noticed with the nail gun is that ever so often a nail would sink really deep. So I had to stop and readjust the setting on the gun. So if you are using a nail gun, just keep an eye out that you don't sink the nails too deep. It is time to install the 2 panels in the front of the shed. One thing I noticed before putting up the first panel is that the 2x4 cripple stud wasn't really centered in the doorway. I had to add a second cripple stud next to the one that was there because I like these front panels to be centered as much as possible. Installing these 2 front panels is pretty straightforward. There are only a couple studs to nail to plus the header. And at this point, I'm not cutting the doorways just yet. We're gonna do that later on.
And then this is my last full sheet. So let's go back around and go through the options we have on how to cut these boards, and you can make the decision which one's the best for you.
The first option cutting these panels is to use a skill saw. Measure the width needed for the panel, snap a chalk line, and run a skill saw through the panel. Then I nail the panel in place just like I've been doing so far. My second option is to cut using a sawzall. First, I need to nail the panel in place, and using a sawzall, cut it from the top going down. For this to work best, you need to set yourself up where you have leverage holding the sawzall and cut straight at the same time. I ended up cutting too much of the panel that was there already, which in this case is not a big deal because I'm gonna be adding trims to these corners. I also used the sawzall cutting the front panels. This worked much better and went way smoother. Next, I'm going to cut the doors using a skill saw, but this time the panels are already nailed to the wall. So what I do is drill few pilot holes around the open on the inside, then go around to the other side and with the level connect the holes marked the opening that we need to cut. And with the skill saw, I cut the door opening following the line we just traced.
And remember, this is her door, so save this board because we're gonna build the door from this board.
Now I am installing my last panel. Make sure when nailing this panel to nail it every 8 inches around the whole window. And I suggest you do the same around the door. Just like the door, I drill few pilot holes around the window from the inside, and then on the outside I trace it with the level. I started cutting the window using a sawzall, but I wanted to show how to cut the window with a jigsaw, so I grabbed a jigsaw and I finished cutting. In my opinion, the skill saw is the fastest and probably easiest way to cut it. There's also the option to cut it with a router if you have one. You now have seen few options on how to cut these panels. I hope this helps you when it's your time to build.
And as I said early on, LP Smart Siding comes pre-primed, so you do need to prime it if you make any cuts. You don't have to do that everywhere. If you're gonna cover with trims or caulk, that should be sufficient. However, if you don't do any of the trim work, you want to go ahead and get some all-purpose exterior primer and just go ahead and prime the edges. And don't worry if you didn't get all of this. I'm making a material list and plans for this very shed, so make sure you check the description below. That should help you make an informed decision whether you want to make this build or hire it out.
Many folks were curious about the cost of installing vinyl siding instead of LP Smart Siding, so I decided to try it out. I removed the sheeting from the side wall of the shed to install vinyl siding. Vinyl siding is a good option if you want to finish your shed or if you want to match the look of your home. It is about 3 times more expensive than LP Smart Siding. But if you're interested in seeing that video, check the description below. I'll have a link for you. So, as you continue watching the video, you notice that one side of the shed will have vinyl siding installed. And that's because I did the experiment. And next, it's time to frame the roof of our shed.
And to start, we need to figure out what kind of roof pitch we want. Do we want a really steep roof or something more flat? The most common pitches in a shed are going to be a 412 or 912. What that means is, for every 12 inches of run, you're going to have 9 inches of rise. This example has a 912 pitch.
Let's take the first rafter. To cut the first rafter, we need 3 measurements: the top cut, the seat cut, and the end cut. The top cut is made right in the beginning of a 2x6 board. I take my speed square and I position right where the board begins. Then you notice there's a mark called pivot. I'm gonna pivot my speed square until I see the number 9. That's because we have a 912 pitch. I then mark my top cut. Next is the seat cut. To find the seat cut, I measure across the entire wall where the rafter will sit. I then divide that by 2 because we only need half the distance for the first rafter. And in this case, we have a distance of 47¼ inches. I take the 47 inches and I divide it by 12. And that's 12 from the 912 pitch that I need. I end up with 3.93. I take that 393 and I multiply by 9 to get my rise distance. Now all I need is to find out the hypotenuse, which is the distance from the top cut to the seat cut. Per the Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. And for me, what that means is 47 squared plus 35 squared will equal to c squared. And to find the c, I take the square root of 3487. And now I have my distance from the top cut to the seat cut, which is the hypotenuse of 59 inches. To mark the 59 inches on the board, I do the same thing I did with the square in the beginning. I pivot the square to the number 9 and I mark it. The last mark is the end cut.
This is more of a personal preference mark. For my shed, I want to have 11 inches of overhang all around. So I add 11 inches to the previous mark. And just like the first two times using the pivot point on the square, I mark my last cut. And this what the marks look like. And now it's time to cut. My first cut is the top cut. The next is the end cut. I leave the seat cut for last. Because first I need to measure 3.5 inches perpendicular to the seat cut mark I made it earlier. It's 3.5 inches because the thickness of a 2x4 wall that I have. I make this cut and now I have my first rafter ready. Now, if this was complicated, let's try a more visual method. Instead of doing all the math, let's take that template we had earlier and make it bigger, about 4 times bigger. But first, I mark half of the wall distance on this OSB. Then, as I said, I make a 4 times bigger template, which it is 4 feet by 36 inches height. I then snap a chalk line on the panel. I make my first cut on the 2x6 board, that's the top cut. I place the 2x6 board right on top of the chalk line. I walk over to where the board intersects with the edge of the OSB panel and I place a mark. This is my seat cut mark. And just like when we did the first cut, using the speed square, we pivot over to the number 9 and mark it. In exactly the same way as earlier, I add 11 inches for my overhang. Then I'm ready to make my cut. And just like earlier as well, we cut the seat next, and that is 3.5 inches measured perpendicular to the seat cut line. And if you have done both approaches, you can check them by laying one on top of the other. These should be the same measurements across. And now that you have 2 cut, we can assemble the first rafter. To assemble the first set of rafters, I laid these 2x6 boards we just cut on top of the OSB platform we're working on. I centered them as much as possible to the center line, and I use a small scrap piece of OSB to secure them together. I cut the excess off with a skill saw and move it over to the shed so we can dry fit it. When dry fitting these rafters for the first time, make sure they sit flat on the 2x4 wall. It's okay if they don't sit correctly. You can always make adjustments by cutting some material off. In my case, I needed to make adjustments because the rafters were interfering with the siding. So I notched about 1/2 inch on the end of the seat cut. And now that we are happy with the first rafter, let's make this a template for every other one. I aligned the rafter with my work platform so it's squared and centered with my center line. I use scrap pieces of wood to make a jig, so every time I assembled one of these rafters, it will be identical to the first one. I took apart the first one that I built and I chose one of the rafter boards as my template to make every single one. And using that template board, I bring it over to my lumber pile and I mark the top cut of every single board. I go on to cut all of them at once and then move on to do the same thing on the end cuts. The last piece here is to cut the seat cuts. And with all the rafter boards cut, I prepare to assemble them. Now that we have cut all of our rafters, we're gonna put it together on this jig we created. And when you do so, make sure that each rafter is on a center line so they're pretty square. So both are center. A little more, here you go. Then I cut a square 12 by 12 from plywood. That's what I'm gonna use to hold this together. So what I do is I line up here with the top. Then we're gonna screw this on with 8 screws. So I have right here my rafters 1, 2, 3, 4, 5,
and one against the wall. Six rafters assembled. In addition to that, I also have two rafters that do not have the seat cut, and these are going to be used for the front and back of the shed overhang. Time to install the rafters on top of the shed. I carry the rafters one at a time and I leave them upside down inside the shed. That's a pretty safe method so they don't fall on you and they stay out of the way. I stand up the first one and I add 2 toe nails on each side of the rafter. When nailing this, make sure to keep them leveled and straight as possible. It's a good practice to tie a string on the first rafter and one on the last to ensure that all other ones are in the center.
Alright, so here's the mistake I made. The shed is 12 feet long, and if we mount a truss every 2 feet, I thought to myself I need 6 trusses. But in reality, I need 7. You start with a truss, and every 2 feet, you mount a new truss. But you don't have to worry because I have plans of this very shed in the description below. And that way, you know exactly how many trusses and all the material you need.
I install the last rafter up and then I move on to installing the plywood on the roof. Anytime I'm working solo, I like to use mounting blocks as much as possible. I screw a bunch of scrap pieces of plywood on the end of the rafters to hold the OSB in place when I bring it up. I measure the plywood that I need for the roof, cut it to length and bring it up to the roof. Whenever carrying the OSB, keep in mind that they do have a side that should be facing down. Plan ahead before you climb the ladder. It is very difficult flipping these pieces of plywood mid-air. I use framing nails to secure the plywood down to the rafters, and I nail them every 12 inches or so. It's time to install the overhang. I cut 6 10.5-inch blocks to make the overhang. I nail 3 on each side, about 2 feet apart. I then bring in the rafter and nail the rafter to the overhang. Then I nail the overhang to the OSB in the roof. I do the same procedure on the back of the shed. This will give me a nice 11 inches of overhead front and back of the shed. Next, I'm gonna install a 3-tab shingle on our shed. So I give the roof a quick look over. I'm looking for any nails that's sticking out, and I want to make sure it's a smooth surface to start off. Then I go on to install the roof underlayment, but before I drag up this heavy roll, I cut just what I need in the ground and then bring that up to the roof. Now, there are a few different types of roof underlayment, and they are measured by weights. The most common are gonna be your 15 weight or 30 weight. For a shed, it doesn't really matter. You can pick the most economical for you. The roof paper are gonna have lines on them. And then you make sure that these lines are facing out because you're gonna use them as guides when installing the shingle. And for the same reason, you want that paper straight as possible, so when you install the shingles and follow the lines, they're pretty straight. To nail down the paper, I use these plastic cap nails. They're pretty inexpensive, and I try to stay away as much as possible from stapling the paper. You're gonna see some people that do staple them. I do not recommend it. One, it rips off the paper, it corrodes, and sometimes the manufacturer will void the warranty of your roof if you do that. When installing the next layer of roof paper, make sure to overlap the previous one with at least 3 inches. When nailing the roof paper, I always try to nail around 12 inches or so apart, and always remember to be safe when working on a roof.
And I prefer to install the drip edges after I'm done with the paper. That's because on the front and the back, the drip edge needs to go on top of the paper. And on the side of the sheds, the drip edge needs to go underneath the paper.
When you reach the roof peak, you want to avoid any seams in the area. The way I do it is I follow the angle of the roof, I mark and cut that off. Then I bend it and tuck it inside. That way, you have a continuous run and you avoid any water intrusion at this point. And to secure the drip edge in place, I nail the drip edge every 12 inches. And whenever overlapping the drip edge, I make sure to overlap with at least 1 inch. In the corners, I like to cut a 45-degree right on top of the drip edge. Underneath these, I cut a straight line. This will create a tab that's about ½ inch long. I bend the tab inside, providing a nice and tight corner. I take my time and I go around installing the drip edge because it is a very important feature of the roofing system. And now it's time to install the starter strips. This box comes with 33 feet of starter strip. This is not enough to cover the whole shed. But let's start with this and I'll show you how you can use the shingles if you run out of starter strips. The starter strip comes with adhesive on the back, which is pretty handy. So all you have to do is peel off the plastic and stick it on the roof. You do want to make sure that the roof glue is on the bottom side of the starter strip. Additionally, I do add a nail every few feet. When you get to a corner, you want to cut this at a 45-degree angle. That way you have continuous roof glue around your corners. Whenever I'm doing roof work, I always stop by the store to pick up hook blades for my utility knife. This is a must when working on the roof. And to help you not have to go to the store multiple times, I added a link to the description below with a shopping cart loaded with all the materials used here today. This will save you hours from shopping. And also you have the option to have it delivered, which is very handy, especially on how heavy roofing shingles are. And now that I ran out of starter strip, I'm gonna make my own using shingles. I cut the 3 tabs off the shingles and I use the top piece of the shingle as a starter strip. When doing this, since they don't have adhesive on the back, I want to make sure to add about 4 or 5 nails per shingle. In the same way as before, in the corners I cut 45-degree off to have continuous roof glue along the roof line. It's time to bring up some roofing material and then we can start roofing. Alright, so we start with the full shingle. On a 3-tab shingle, you want to have 4 nails. 1 in the beginning and 1 on top of every notch of these. So you want to install these with 1/4 inch to 3/4 inch overlap on the drip edge, both the side and the bottom. Make sure it's nice and square going down. Right here, nice and level, straight going down. And you add 4 nails on a 3-tab shingle. On the second layer, you want the shingle to overlap. When I say that, put this over here. You do not want this cut on top of the cut. You want to intersect them. You want them right in the middle. So it goes right here. This cut goes in the middle. And you want to cover these nails up with the shingle above it. Now when you get to the end here, you obviously know you're running out of space. So you bring in your nail and you nail just on the end. You take the next one and you follow that line. Same as before, make sure it's going down straight. Okay, so the next one, you want to stagger this. So the first one was here, second one is here, third one, you want it right here. You want to make a stairs. And you want to keep doing this all the way up. You can definitely shingle this roof with a hammer. But if you think of getting a nail gun like this one, or any tools I used here today, I have a link in the description with my favorite tools shared with you guys. Make sure you take advantage of using the lines on this paper. Overall,
It's not too tricky installing shingles on the roof. It's just very labor intensive. So make sure you pick a day with really good weather and if possible, ask a friend for help. My biggest problem was climbing up and down the ladder throughout the day. Having a second person handling material and picking up that tool when you drop it, it's really helpful. When you're done installing shingles, you need to install the ridge cap. A ridge cap can be made from a shingle. You have to cut it straight between the notches. For me, I prefer to cut in an angle so the installation is much easier. And to install the ridge cap, you need to add a couple screws, one on each side, and stagger them going down the ridge. At this point, you cut off the excess shingles that's hanging off on the side, and also give a quick walk around, checking out the shingles you just installed. And now with the roof done, I'm gonna get ready and install that window next and trim out the whole shed. The window I'm installing on this shed is a 24 by 36 new construction window. When you go to the store, you're gonna see many different sizes and types. Make sure to choose one that has a fin where you can insert a nail and secure the window to the wall. Then you wanna make sure that the window frame is big enough for the window. You can either measure it or do what I did, dry fit with the actual window. Not only the window should fit in the frame, but also should have about ½ inch of play either way. Then it's time to add sealing tape to the window sill. This tape is very sticky and yet very easy to work. You can cut it with a utility knife or with scissors, and all you do is you peel the back and you stick the seal tape to the surface you intend to seal. Then to tape it over the seal, I cut the sides with a utility knife and fold it over. I use a 6-inch piece on the corners to make sure it's sealed pretty well. Then I want to make sure to center the window to the window frame. So I make a mark on the window frame and I do the same thing on the window. And the first mistake I see many people do is apply silicone all around the window. When in reality, all you need is about ½ inch bead of silicone on the sides and the top. That's because if any water gets inside the window frame, it needs a place to run out. And since we're installing these windows over the LP Smart siding, we're going to have these grooves on top. So make sure to be generous with the silicone between the grooves. And mistake number 2 is setting the window directly on top of the window sill. You do want to keep about ½ inch of a gap between the window and the sill. And for that, you can use either shims, scrap wood, or what a lot of people use in this case is their carpenter pencil. I then insert the window into the frame and I tack one nail to hold the window in place. We need to make sure that the window is centered and level. Check that the window is fully closed and locked on the inside. And if by any means the window is not level, you can change the pencil for shims and level the window at that point. And number 3 is using general drywall screws to install your window. What you want to use is actually roofing nails, at least 1.5 inches, preferably 2-inch roofing nails. And you do want to put them on every slot of the window all the way around. Take your time, especially going on top, so you don't hit the window by accident. What you want to do is, you want to go a little at a time. Don't try to overpower the nails and miss it. You could use screws, just make sure they're corrosion resistant. The reason I don't like screws is because their head is too bulky and sometimes it gets in the way when trimming the window. Some windows will have these fillers used for shipment. Just pry them open and now you need to make sure that the window opens and closes easily. Now it's time to install sealing tape around the window. In my case, I'll be using 3-inch trim and this tape is too wide for that. So I cut the tape in half, which is just enough to cover the windows, providing a proper seal. Then I install the tape on the left side of the window, the right side, and also the top. When installing this tape, I make sure to apply a lot of pressure to the tape to make sure it seals well. As I said before, the downside of installing window over the LP smart siding is that we're gonna end up with these grooves. And what we can do is, when we trim the window out, we can make sure that these grooves are sealed with silicone. And now, personally, I won't add any tape to the bottom of the window, just on the theory on if water gets inside, it has a place to run out. Let me know in the comments what you think of that idea. If you're doing an installation like this for a new home, it's pretty much the same thing. The only other thing is that now you would work on the inside, insulating the window with expansion foam. And before I start trimming the shed, I need to add siding above the walls on the front and the back. And to have a place to nail the siding to, I add 2x4s on top of the wall. Whenever joining this LP smart siding vertically, you want to add flashing to ensure there's no water intrusion behind the siding. And cutting the flashing is pretty easy. All you have to do is transfer the distance that you need over to the flashing and cut it with a thin snip. To secure the flashing in place, I add roofing nails to the inside of the flashing every 16 inches. And when installing this, just make sure you have installed the correct way, which is having the longer tab inside the sheeting panels. It's time to measure and cut the siding. And don't worry if you don't have this perfect, because we are adding 2-inch trims along the top of the soffit to hide any imperfection. One mistake I made here is not centering the groove of the siding to the center of the roof pitch. It is ½ inch off, you can barely notice, but it's there. And on the inside, this is what it would look like. So do the same thing for the back of the shed, and then we can move on to installing the soffit. LP makes a panel board that's a little thinner than siding, and it's a perfect panel board to be used for soffits. You can cut these boards with a table saw if you have one handy. If you don't, you can create a straight edge using one of the trims and couple clamps. Then you cut it with a circular saw. This is a great way to get a straight cut, and you don't have to carry a table saw all the way to the back of the yard. Then I install the panel into the soffit, and when I do this, I make sure to hug the fascia board all the way around, because on the inside we can cover it up with the 2-inch trim we're going to be installing later on. And this is how the flashing looks after we install the LP smart sheeting. And this is the soffit. As I said, you notice a gap between the soffit and the wall, but don't worry, that's going to get covered up with trim later on. The first few soffit panels are going to be a little more difficult, but very quickly you're going to get the hang of it, and then just go around the whole shed installing the panels in place. Now we're going to trim out these corners and the doorway. And for trim, we're going to use the same material as the siding, LP trim. Now they come in various different sizes. This one is a 4-inch wide. We're going to use a 4-inch wide on the front, on the top of the doors, and then we're going to use around the corners of the soffits. And to make easier on myself, I add blocking to the end of the shed, so when I install the trim, it's flushed with the wall. It also makes it easier to mark the end of the trim so you can cut it later. I nailed the trim to the shed with 2 nails going from the bottom up every 16 inches. And when purchasing the nails for the trim, make sure it's outdoor rated. If you don't have a finish nailer, you can nail the trims by hand. Just make sure to use 2-inch trim nails. Between the soffit and the wall, I install 2-inch wide trims. To help hold the trim in place, I use clamps so I can mark it and cut them. And for the smaller trim, I add nails every 10 inches or so, just to make sure they don't move. And one trick you can use to find the angle of your cut is that you place your trim against the wall, and with the scrap board you lay that against the trim and against the soffit. Then you can use your pencil to mark the angle you need to cut. You then nail the trim in place. Some people will recommend and suggest to use construction adhesive on the trim boards. It does make a better installation. It is up to you if you want to add the extra step of adding adhesive behind the boards. And this is what the corner will look like. You just gotta do the same for all four corners. Then I go around the shed working on one board at a time, from the corners to the soffits, making sure it's nice and snug and it's well secured. Now when I come across the two trim boards not lining up perfectly, I use a clamp to get them tight together. Then I nail them in place. It's time to work on the door. I am a really big fan of using blocks everywhere. You're gonna see me using the blocks to make sure that the trim it's level against the door opening and also it's centered with the door. And I keep the same nailing pattern on the trims around the door. Every 16 inches I add 2 nails. And on this build I have one window on the side that needs to be trimmed. You may have more than one window on your shed, but it's very similar either way. I start trimming from the top down and using the same nail pattern. Alright, so we're very close to being done with the shed. Next is building the door. We are building a barn style double door on this shed. And before we start, we need to cut off the bottom plate of our walls. These can be cut fairly easy since we didn't nail to the floor. You just cut them off with a sawzall and move them out of the way. And the first thing you need to do is find yourself a flat surface to work on. And there's nothing else better than the actual floor of your shed. And what we do is we measure the height of the wall opening and we cut the studs 3/4 of an inch shorter than the wall opening. And then the width is going to be 1/2 inch narrow than the actual opening. But don't worry, if you need help on these measurements, you can check the description below where we're going to have plans for the whole shed, including the plans for these doors. And here's my first tip. I recommend you choosing the best lumber you can get at the lumber store. That's because if it's warped, you're going to have a bad time straightening out the door later. And if you cannot get good straight lumber, you can grab a scrap piece of lumber and a clamp and clamp them together so it's nice and straight when you start screwing in the middle pieces. I use 2.5 inch exterior screws to screw the 2x4s together. I drive the screw in straight just enough to grab the wood, then I turn at a 50-degree angle and drive the screw home. I go then adding a screw on the other side and I do the same on the back. When you finish here, just check that the joints are nice and flat. Now that you have done one, flip the frame over and do the same thing on the other side. Each side gets 2 screws and make sure it's on a nice and flat surface. And as you see, you frame a square and then you add a block in the middle. Now you may ask, why do I need this block in the middle? 2 things. So this block, it's actually keeping these 2 boards straight, 1. And number 2, if you have a 3 hinge door system, you need 3 places for the hinge to screw on. And this block, it's supporting the center hinge on the center of the door. And for this next board, it goes right in the center of the frame. So you measure that. And again, as before, 2 screws on each end. I'm using plywood as a backer for these doors. And for that, I need to cut a section that is 31 by 82 inches. And to screw the boards to the frame, I'm using the same screws I use for the flooring. That way I don't have to buy any new screws. So I start in the corners and just work my way around the door frame, screwing every 8 inches or so. You flip the frame over and on the back of the shed, you grab that piece of siding that we've been saving since the beginning. You want to square off the siding so the excess it's on the bottom of the door. I nail the siding to the door frame every 8 to 10 inches using siding nails. I ended up with this 1/2 inch lip on the siding, so I used the chalk line to snap it straight, and I cut it off with a circular saw. Then it's time to trim out your door. Now, I cut few pieces of trim board here. I use two smaller pieces on the bottom and the top. These are 31 inches long. Then I use a longer piece here on the side. That's 76 1/4, I believe. Then another one right here. And the middle piece. This is about 26 inches. Now, this is really important, the middle one, because you're gonna use this to attach your hinge to it. So you really need a center piece. Now I nailed the trims to the door. So whether you're using a hammer or a finish nailer, just nail the trims to the door every 8 inches. Time to mount the door. So you need some spacers to keep the door off the floor. Also, you're gonna need some spacers to be used on the side of the door. That way you have a little gap between the door and the door frame. And you're gonna need some shims in case the door is not level. You wanna be able to grab a level the door, and shim it off as needed. So I set the door right on top of the 1/2 inch spacer and adjust it into place. You can use a set of clamps to help hold the door in place as you work around it. I start working on the middle hinge first. The screw that comes with the hinge doesn't have a good biting force in my opinion. So first I screw a drywall screw to hold the hinge in place. Then I install all the other screws and replace the drywall screw last. Second hinge to be installed will be the bottom one. And then the last one, it's the top hinge. It's time to try out the new door. A good test to make sure that the door is level and installed correctly is by opening the door and making sure that the door doesn't move after you let it go. The bottom of the door should close against the shed frame, and the top of the door in a perfect scenario should line up with the shed. If it doesn't, it's because the frame was warped. In that case, it's probably the lumber. To fix this, you can add threshold on the inside of the door frame. And then I do the same thing with the other door, set it in place and screwing in the hinges. And I use this type of latch. It's similar to what I use on fences. It's pretty inexpensive, really easy to install, and it goes well with this shed. There are many types available. You can check your local hardware store for other options. And now, with the doors built, I'm gonna go ahead and throw a coat of paint on this shed. A shed this big will take about 2 gallons of paint. I hope this video was pretty straightforward and helpful so you can build a shed like this yourself. Let me know in the comments if there's anything I missed or that you want to see different next time. Stay tuned for more shed videos in our channel. I hope you like this build, and I'll see you on the next one.